The sun was slipping down behind the hills, and the wide open land of the west was covered in gold and shadow. Samuel the rancher sat on his porch chair with his hat pulled low, watching the cattle move slowly back toward the barn. The day had been long, like all his days, filled with hard work and silence. Since his wife had passed away years ago, the ranch had been quiet. The walls of the house echoed with emptiness, and though Samuel was strong and steady, loneliness was something he could not fight off. He had learned to live with it, but each evening when the sun went down it pressed on him a little harder. That evening seemed like any other, until he noticed movement on the dirt road. At first he thought it was just dust blowing in the wind, but then he saw a figure walking slowly, almost dragging her feet. A young woman was making her way toward his ranch, carrying a small worn bag. She looked tired. Her dress was dusty and her shoes seemed to have carried her over too many miles. Samuel leaned forward, curious but cautious. Strangers didn't often come walking by in this part of the country. The woman stopped at the gate, holding onto the wood post as though she wasn't sure if she had the strength to step farther. Samuel stood slowly and tipped his hat, his deep voice breaking the silence. "Evenin'," he said. She looked up, startled, but her eyes showed more weariness than fear. For a moment she seemed unsure of what to say. Then she stepped closer to the gate. Her voice was quiet, trembling, but clear enough to hear. "If I cook and clean, can I stay?" she asked. The words hung in the air, simple yet heavy. Samuel blinked. He hadn't expected that. He studied her carefully. She couldn't have been more than 20, maybe a little older. Her face carried the marks of hardship, but there was honesty in her eyes. She wasn't begging, she wasn't demanding. She was offering something in return for a roof, a meal, maybe safety. For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. He thought about his life. The empty kitchen, the unwashed dishes that piled up when he was too tired to care, the meals of beans and bread eaten alone, the sound of the wind filling the space his wife's laughter once filled. His heart tightened at the memory, but the silence between him and the young woman felt even heavier. He walked slowly to the porch rail, resting his hands on it, his weathered face calm but thoughtful. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara," she said softly, clutching her bag tighter. He gave a small nod. "You hungry?" She nodded once, her eyes lowering as though she didn't want to appear too needy. Samuel stood there thinking. A stranger on his land was not something he took lightly. The West could be rough, and trust was not given easily. But he also knew what it was like to be tired, to have nowhere to go. And there was something about her voice, a mix of strength and sorrow that reached him deeper than he expected. Instead of answering right away, he pulled a chair from the porch table and placed it nearby. He nodded toward it. "Sit. Let's talk." Clara hesitated, but then she walked through the gate slowly, almost shyly, as if afraid he would change his mind. She sat down carefully, placing her bag at her feet. Samuel lowered himself back into his own chair, his movements steady, his eyes never leaving her face. For a few moments, the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass and the distant call of a cow. Finally, Samuel spoke again. "Where you comin' from?" Clara looked down at her hands, folding them in her lap. "From town, but before that, I've been moving place to place. My family's gone. I don't have anyone left." Her voice trembled at the edges, but she steadied it. "I can cook. I can clean. I can help. I just need somewhere I can rest, at least for a little while." Samuel listened carefully. He didn't hear deceit. He heard truth, and he also heard fear, the fear of being sent away. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "You're young to be wandering alone," he said. "I didn't choose it," she replied quietly, "but I have to keep going." They sat there for a while, the fading light painting the sky in pink and orange. Samuel rubbed his chin, his thoughts turning over like the wheels of a slow wagon. He thought of the empty bed inside, the silent meals, the way the house had felt more like a shell than a home since his wife's passing. He thought of how it felt even now to hear another voice in the air, to see someone sitting across from him. Finally, he gave a short nod. "You can stay for supper," he said. "We'll see after that." Clara's eyes lifted to his, a flicker of hope sparking in them. "Thank you," she whispered. He stood, motioning toward the door. "Come on, then. Food don't cook itself." Inside, the house smelled of wood and dust, the kitchen table holding nothing but a lantern and a loaf of bread. Samuel busied himself with pulling out beans and a bit of salt pork, while Clara quietly moved about as if she already belonged there. She found dishes, wiped them down, and set them neatly on the table. Her movements were careful, almost graceful, though Samuel could tell she was weary to the bone. When the meal was ready, they sat across from each other. The glow of the lantern lit their faces, and for the first time in years, Samuel felt like he wasn't eating alone. Clara ate slowly with gratitude, her eyes soft with relief. Samuel studied her quietly, noticing the way her shoulders relaxed little by little as if she was finally safe. After they finished, Samuel leaned back and let out a long breath. "You said you'd cook and clean," he said. "This house could use both. But I don't keep boarders. If you're gonna stay, you treat this place like it's yours too." Clara nodded quickly, her voice steady now. "I will, I promise." Samuel gave her a long look, then nodded once more. Something inside him had already decided the moment she asked at the gate, but he made it sound like a choice. In truth, he knew his quiet home had been waiting for a sound like hers. The lantern flickered, and outside the crickets sang. For the first time in many nights, Samuel felt a strange warmth in the room. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the beginning of something new. The night grew darker, and the ranch lay quiet under the wide western sky. Clara sat on the edge of the small bed Samuel had shown her. It was in the spare room that had gathered dust for years. She ran her fingers across the old quilt, feeling both relief and worry. She was thankful to have a roof over her head for tonight, but her heart pounded with questions. Would he let her stay beyond one meal and one night? Would he trust her enough? She whispered a prayer of thanks and a small hope that this place could become more than just a stop on her journey. Samuel, in his own room across the hall, lay awake too. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of Clara moving quietly. He thought of her tired eyes, her voice when she asked to stay, and the way she set the dishes on the table as if it were already her home. He hadn't realized how much he missed the simple rhythm of another person's presence. Still, he was cautious. Life in the West was tough, and letting someone into his life again felt like opening an old wound. But he couldn't deny that something about her felt different, like she belonged here more than even she knew. The next morning, Clara woke before sunrise. She dressed quickly, brushed her hair, and stepped into the kitchen. Samuel was already outside feeding the animals, but she wanted to prove herself. She found flour, eggs, and bacon and began cooking. The smell filled the house, warm and inviting. When Samuel came in, wiping the dust from his hands, he stopped in the doorway. The kitchen that had been cold and silent now carried the sound of a skillet and the sight of someone bustling around. "Smells better than I've had in years," he said, his voice low but touched with surprise. Clara turned, smiling shyly. "Breakfast is almost ready." They sat together at the table once again, this time with eggs, biscuits, and bacon. Samuel ate slowly, enjoying every bite. "You weren't lying when you said you could cook," he said, breaking a small smile. Clara's eyes lit with relief. "I can do more. I can clean, mend clothes, even help outside if you'll teach me." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Outside work ain't easy. It's long hours, sunburn, sore muscles. You sure you're up for that?" She nodded firmly. "I've walked miles alone. I've worked wherever I could to survive. I won't break." There was something in her tone that made Samuel believe her. After breakfast, he showed her the barn, the chicken coop, and the vegetable garden. Clara listened carefully, asking questions, paying attention to every detail. By the end of the morning, Samuel noticed the house looked different. The windows had been wiped, the chairs dusted, the floors swept. Clara moved with energy, filling the place with life. As the days passed, a rhythm grew between them. Samuel would head out early to tend the cattle, and Clara would begin with chores in the house. By afternoon, she would join him in the fields, handing him tools, learning how to mend fences, carrying water when the sun was high. At night, they would share meals at the table, lantern light casting shadows on the walls, and for the first time in years, Samuel would sometimes find himself talking, not just about the cattle or the weather, but about his memories, his late wife, and the years of building the ranch with his own two hands. Clara listened quietly, never interrupting, her eyes soft with understanding. She didn't push him to speak more than he wanted, but she gave him the gift of listening. In return, she began to share pieces of her own story. She told him how her family had fallen sick one by one, leaving her alone. She told him about wandering from one town to another, working for food, always fearing the day someone would turn her away. She confessed that when she saw his ranch, she thought it was her last chance to ask for shelter before her strength gave out. Samuel's heart ached hearing her story. He had known loss, but hers was different. Hers was the kind that left someone untethered, drifting in a world that could be unforgiving. He began to admire her courage, the way she carried herself despite her hardships. Word of Clara's presence soon reached the nearby town. Ranchers and neighbors began to notice changes. Samuel's ranch looked livelier, fences mended quicker, the house looking brighter. Some whispered that Samuel had taken in a stray girl out of loneliness. Others said Clara was clever and had found herself a comfortable place by latching onto an old widower. Gossip traveled fast in small places. Clara heard whispers when she went to town for supplies. Two women near the store door said loudly, "She's got herself set up nice cooking for that rancher. Smart girl." Another voice chimed in, "Or foolish man taking in someone he barely knows." Clara felt her cheeks burn with shame and fear. She avoided their eyes and hurried back to the wagon. That night she grew quiet at supper, her fork moving slowly through her food. Samuel noticed immediately. "You're not eating," he said. Clara hesitated, then finally asked softly, "Do you believe what they say in town? That I'm only here to take advantage of you?" Samuel set his fork down and leaned back, his eyes steady on hers. "I don't put much stock in gossip," he said firmly. "Folks always got something to say, especially when they don't know the truth. What I see is you working hard making this place better. That's all that matters." Her eyes softened, tears threatening to rise, but she blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave her a small nod. "This ranch doesn't listen to gossip. It listens to hard work and trust. You've shown both." His words steadied her heart. She realized Samuel's trust mattered more than the chatter of strangers. Still, she promised herself she would work even harder, so no one could ever say she hadn't earned her place there. As summer days stretched on, the bond between them grew. Sometimes in the evenings, Samuel would bring his chair out onto the porch and Clara would sit nearby. They would watch the sunset over the plains in silence, a comfortable kind of silence. The house that once echoed with emptiness now carried the warmth of shared meals, soft laughter, and the sense of two lives slowly weaving together. Clara often thought back to the night she first stood at his gate, her voice trembling as she asked to stay. It amazed her how quickly life had changed since then. Samuel, too, thought of that moment often, how a simple question had cracked open the door to something he thought he'd never feel again. Hope. And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew this was more than just a deal of food for work. Something was stirring in the quiet spaces of the ranch, something neither had expected but both were beginning to welcome. The days on the ranch began to fall into a steady rhythm. Samuel rose with the first light, the rooster's crow echoing across the land, and Clara followed not long after, already in the kitchen preparing coffee and a hot breakfast. The smell of biscuits and fried potatoes drifted through the house, a welcome change from the plain beans and bread Samuel had lived on for years. After they ate, Samuel would saddle his horse and check on the cattle. Clara would start with sweeping, laundry, and mending, her hands always busy. Yet she never stayed inside all day. By mid-morning, she tied back her hair, put on her boots, and walked out to the pastures, ready to learn whatever Samuel could teach her. At first, he thought she might give up after a day or two under the hot sun, but she surprised him. She learned how to carry feed, fix a broken fence, and lead stubborn cattle back into line. She listened closely, worked hard, and even laughed sometimes when the work got messy. Samuel found himself smiling at her determination. She reminded him of someone who refused to quit, no matter the weight she carried. Life grew lighter around the ranch. Samuel no longer felt the long silence pressing on him, Clara's voice humming while she cooked, or her laughter when the chickens scattered too quickly filled the air with a warmth that had been missing for so long. But life in the West was never without challenge. One afternoon, Samuel and Clara walked into town to trade supplies. The storekeeper greeted Samuel with respect, but his eyes lingered on Clara in a way that made her shift uncomfortably. Outside, she heard whispers again. A few townsfolk said she was clever for finding a man with land to look after her. Others muttered she was nothing more than a burden Samuel didn't need. Clara tried to ignore it, but as they loaded the supplies onto the wagon, she asked Samuel softly, "Do you ever wish you hadn't let me stay? Folks in town make it sound like I don't belong here." Samuel tightened the rope around the supplies and straightened up, his voice steady. I don't run my life by what folks in town think. This is my land, my home, and I'll decide who belongs here. Right now you've earned your place every single day." His words made Clara's chest loosen. She smiled faintly, but deep inside she still feared losing this safe place she had found. Weeks turned into months, and Clara grew stronger in body and spirit. Samuel began teaching her to ride properly. She clung tightly to the reins at first, her knuckles white. But Samuel's calm voice guided her. "Don't fight the horse, trust it. Steady your seat, keep your back straight." Slowly, her fear melted into confidence. Soon she was riding beside him across the open plains, her hair flying in the wind, her laughter mixing with his deep chuckle. The neighbors noticed the changes too. One older rancher passing by nodded at Samuel and said, "Never seen your place look this alive, Sam. Guess that young woman's been good for you." Samuel didn't answer right away. He only tipped his hat, but inside he felt the truth of those words. Clara hadn't just brought life to his home. She had stirred life in him again, something he thought had been buried with his wife. Clara, meanwhile, found herself learning more than ranch work. She learned the small details of Samuel's character. How he was quiet but kind. How he always fixed what was broken instead of throwing it away. How he never wasted food or water. She noticed how he treated the animals with care, speaking gently to his horse as if it were an old friend. These things built respect in her heart. One evening, as the sky turned orange and the crickets began to sing, Clara sat on the porch with Samuel. He rocked slowly in his chair, sipping coffee, while she sewed a small tear in one of his shirts. The quiet between them was peaceful. Finally, she said softly, "I didn't think I'd ever find a place where I felt safe again, but here, it feels like I belong." Samuel glanced at her, his rough features softened by the glow of sunset. "You do belong," he said simply. Her hands paused on the fabric, her eyes shining as she whispered, "Thank you." But just as their bond grew stronger, life decided to test them. Late one afternoon, storm clouds gathered thick and dark. The wind rose, sharp and restless. Samuel knew trouble was coming. He hurried to the barn and Clara followed. Soon the storm broke. Thunder rolled. Lightning cracked across the sky and the rain came down hard. Through the sheets of rain, Samuel saw movement in the pasture. A section of the fence had broken under the wind, and the cattle were pushing through. Without hesitation, Samuel grabbed a rope and ran out into the storm. Clara didn't think twice. She ran after him. The rain soaked them to the skin as they fought to push the cattle back, the mud pulling at their boots. Clara slipped once, but Samuel caught her arm and pulled her up. "Stay close," he shouted over the thunder. She nodded, determination burning in her eyes. For hours they battled the storm together. Clara shouted, waved, and pushed with all her strength, not caring how soaked or tired she was. Samuel was amazed. This was no helpless girl. She was fierce, willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with him in the worst of weather. By the time the storm passed, most of the cattle were safe inside the barn. Both of them collapsed against the fence, panting, covered in mud. Samuel turned to her, his chest heaving, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. Her hair was plastered to her face, her clothes heavy with rain, but her eyes held a spark of pride and fire. "You've got grit, Clara," he said at last, his voice low. She smiled weakly, wiping rain from her brow. "Told you I wouldn't break." In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. They weren't just a rancher and a stranger sharing chores. They were partners. That night, back in the house, they sat at the table wrapped in blankets, sipping hot coffee. The storm outside was fading, leaving only the soft patter of rain. Samuel glanced at Clara and said, "I thought I was taking someone in to help with the house, but you've done more than that. You've stood with me in the hardest fight this ranch has seen in years." Clara's cheeks warmed. "I just wanted to prove I belong." "You already proved it," Samuel replied. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words filled the room. Clara lowered her eyes, her heart beating faster. For the first time since she lost everything, she felt not just safe, but truly valued. The storm had left the land soaked, but in their hearts, something stronger had taken root. Trust, respect, and the beginnings of something deeper that neither dared name just yet. The storm had passed, but its memory stayed with Samuel and Clara. The land was wet and heavy, and the fence needed repairs, but there was also a quiet sense of pride in their hearts. They had faced something hard together and come through it side by side. Samuel woke early the next morning, stepping out onto the porch with his coffee. The sky was washed clean from the rain, and the air carried the smell of wet earth. He looked over the ranch and thought how different it felt now with Clara here. She had brought strength to his home, not just warmth. Inside, Clara moved about the kitchen, her hair tied back, humming softly as she cooked. She was sore from the long night in the storm, but she didn't let it slow her down. When Samuel walked in, she placed a plate of eggs and biscuits on the table. "You'll need the strength for all that fence work," she said with a small smile. Samuel chuckled, sitting down. "You're not wrong about that." He studied her for a moment as she poured his coffee. She looked different somehow. Standing tall, her eyes brighter, her voice steadier. She had proven herself in the storm, and he respected her more deeply than ever. After breakfast, they set out to fix the broken fence. Clara carried posts and hammered nails alongside Samuel. Her hands grew blistered, but she didn't complain. Every time Samuel offered to take over, she shook her head firmly. "I can do it," she said. And she did. By evening, the fence was whole again, and the cattle were grazing calmly. The days rolled on, and the ranch grew stronger with their shared effort. But not everything came easy. In town, whispers still circled. Some neighbors praised Samuel for taking in someone who clearly worked hard, but others continued to raise eyebrows. One evening at the feed store, an older man muttered just loud enough for Samuel to hear, "Careful, Sam. Young girl like that'll run off as soon as something better comes along." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He simply loaded his supplies and walked out. Later, when Clara noticed he was quieter than usual, she asked, "Did someone say something again?" He hesitated before answering. "Folks will always have opinions, but I know what I see here every day, and that's enough for me." Clara's chest filled with warmth at his words. She wanted to tell him how much they meant, but instead she only smiled and went back to preparing supper. One afternoon, trouble came again. Not from the weather this time, but from men. A group of passing drifters stopped by the ranch asking for water and food. Samuel, being fair, offered them water and bread, but one of the men eyed Clara in a way that made her step back. His tone was sharp when he said, "Didn't know you kept company now, Sam." Samuel's eyes hardened. He stood tall, his voice calm but firm. "She belongs here. Take your water and move along." The men laughed, muttered something under their breath, and finally left. Clara's hands were trembling as she closed the door behind them. Samuel noticed and spoke gently. "Don't let men like that trouble you. This is your home now, and I won't let anyone take that away." His words sank deep into her heart. For the first time in years, she felt defended, protected not just by walls or a roof, but by someone who truly cared about her. As the weeks passed, Clara and Samuel worked together in every part of ranch life. She learned how to rope a calf, how to plant seeds in the garden, and even how to patch up a saddle. Samuel sometimes watched her with quiet amazement, wondering how such a young woman carried so much strength inside her. Clara noticed changes in Samuel too. He laughed more often, small chuckles that came from deep in his chest. He talked more, telling stories of his younger years, of how he built the ranch with his wife. At first, Clara worried she might be stepping into a place that belonged to someone else's memory. But Samuel spoke of it with peace, not pain. "Life moves on," he said one night, staring into the fire. "We carry the ones we've lost, but we keep living. You've reminded me of that." Clara's throat tightened at his words. She looked at him, this man who had given her shelter and trust, and realized she wanted to be part of his life more than she had ever wanted anything. One late afternoon, the ranch was tested once more. A calf had gotten stuck in the mud near the creek, bleeding loudly. Samuel rushed down with a rope, and Clara followed. The mud was thick and deep, pulling at their boots as they struggled to free the calf. Samuel tied the rope around its middle and pulled with all his strength while Clara pushed from behind. Together, grunting and sweating, they finally dragged the animal out onto solid ground. Both of them collapsed in the grass, covered in mud, but laughing breathlessly. Clara lay back, the sky wide above her, her heart pounding. Samuel turned his head toward her, his hat lying forgotten beside him. "You're something else, Clara," he said with a grin. She smiled back, cheeks flushed. "And you thought I'd break." He laughed, a real laugh that echoed across the field. It had been a long time since Samuel had laughed like that. That evening, as the sun set, Samuel did something he hadn't done in years. He brought 2 chairs out onto the porch and set them side by side. He carried 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Clara. She looked at him surprised as he sat down. This porch always felt too quiet, he said softly. "But with you here, it feels right." Clara held the warm cup in her hands, her heart beating fast. The golden light of the sunset touched his weathered face, and for a moment, she saw not just a rancher but a man who had opened his heart again. They sat together in silence, sipping their coffee, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. The crickets began to sing, and the land settled into its night rhythm. Samuel glanced at Clara and said quietly, "You've given this place more than work. You've given it life again." Clara blinked back sudden tears, nodding. "And you've given me something I thought I lost forever. A home." Neither of them said more, but the truth was clear between them. Their bond had been tested by storms, gossip, and hardship, yet it had only grown stronger. The ranch was no longer just Samuel's land. It was their land, a place built not just with sweat and labor, but with trust and quiet care. As the stars began to appear, Samuel leaned back in his chair, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. Clara, sitting beside him, felt the same, and though they didn't speak of it, both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The summer stretched on, and the ranch settled into a steady peace. Every day began with the sun spilling across the plains, warming the fields and touching the roof of the little house. Samuel and Clara worked side by side, their days full but no longer heavy with silence. Where once the house had echoed with emptiness, now it was alive with the sound of cooking, laughter, and conversation. One morning, Samuel came in from the barn carrying a basket of fresh eggs. He set them on the table, where Clara was kneading dough for bread. She looked up with a smile, her hands dusted with flour. "You've been up since dawn again," she teased. "Cattle don't feed themselves," Samuel replied. But there was a twinkle in his eye that hadn't been there months ago. He washed his hands and poured himself coffee, watching her work with easy grace. He thought about the day she first walked through his gate, asking in a trembling voice if she could stay. Now she moved through the kitchen as though she had always belonged there. After breakfast, they went out together to mend the last section of fence the storm had damaged weeks before. Clara carried tools while Samuel dug post holes. The sun was hot, but they worked in rhythm, talking as they went. Clara asked about Samuel's younger days, and he told her about learning ranching from his father. She listened with interest, asking questions, laughing at small details. He found himself enjoying the way she made him remember stories he hadn't spoken of in years. As they worked, neighbors passed by on horseback. One man raised his hand in greeting. "Fence looks good, Sam. Heard you've been putting that young lady to work. She's done you proud." Clara's cheeks flushed, but Samuel only tipped his hat and replied, "She's more than done me proud. Couldn't have managed without her." His voice was firm, carrying a respect that made Clara's heart swell. That evening, Clara sat on the porch with a basket of mending. Samuel joined her with 2 cups of coffee. They watched the sun drop low across the fields, painting the sky orange and purple. Clara worked quietly, her fingers moving through fabric, but her mind was far away. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loss of her family, the long roads, the fear of being turned away again and again. And now, here she was, sitting on a ranch porch beside a man who had given her not only shelter, but dignity and trust. Samuel watched her, noticing the faraway look in her eyes. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Clara hesitated, then said, "How quickly life can change. A few months ago, I didn't know where I would sleep from one night to the next. Now I feel like I've found something I didn't dare hope for." Samuel leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes the best things come when we least expect them." Clara's eyes filled with quiet emotion, but she didn't speak. Instead, she let the peace of the moment wash over her. The next few weeks brought more work, but also more ease between them. Clara grew skilled at riding and could guide cattle with confidence. Samuel often found himself watching her as she rode across the pasture, sitting tall in the saddle, her hair blowing in the wind. She carried herself with strength, yet also with kindness, speaking gently to the animals. One evening, after a long day, Samuel cooked supper for the first time since Clara had arrived. She raised her eyebrows in surprise when he placed a plate in front of her. "Didn't know you could cook," she teased. "Don't let it fool you," Samuel said with a small smile. "Beans and bacon are about the only thing I can manage, but I figured you deserved a rest." Clara laughed softly, touched by the gesture. They ate together, the lantern flickering between them. The warmth in the room was not just from the food, but from the steady companionship they had built. As autumn approached, the air grew cooler and the evenings longer. Samuel brought in extra wood for the stove, while Clara preserved vegetables from the garden. They worked side by side preparing for winter. One night as they sat by the fire, Clara spoke quietly. "Samuel, do you ever think about the future? About what comes next?" He looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Used to. I thought my life had already been written. Thought the years ahead would just be me, the cattle, and the land until my time came. But lately—" He paused, glancing at her. "Lately, I've been thinking maybe there's more." Clara's breath caught. She lowered her eyes, her cheeks warm, but her heart lifted with hope. Winter came and the ranch grew quiet under the snow. Clara and Samuel spent more time indoors, sharing stories, playing simple card games, and sitting in the glow of the fire. The closeness between them deepened, built not on quick words, but on steady days and shared effort. Samuel often found himself reaching for her opinion, asking her thoughts on the ranch and listening with respect. Clara, in turn, leaned on his wisdom and steadiness, feeling safer than she ever had before. One cold evening, Samuel went out to check the barn while Clara stirred stew on the stove. When he returned, snow clinging to his coat, he brought 2 chairs to the fire and set them side by side. He handed her a cup of coffee and sat down next to her. "This ranch used to feel too big for one person," he said quietly. "Now it feels right, because it's not just mine anymore, it's ours." Clara looked at him, her eyes shining. "Ours," she repeated softly. They sat together, the fire crackling, the snow falling softly outside. For the first time, Clara felt the full weight of what had changed. She was no longer a wanderer, no longer a guest asking for a chance. She was part of a home, part of a life, part of something steady and true. As the months passed, neighbors began to speak less of gossip and more of respect. They saw the ranch, thriving, saw Samuel and Clara working together like true partners. Some nodded in quiet approval. Others smiled knowingly when they rode past. Samuel didn't care what was said anymore, but Clara felt a deep relief. The whispers of doubt had faded, replaced by recognition of what she had built with her own hands and heart. One spring morning, as the wildflowers began to bloom again, Samuel and Clara sat once more on the porch. 2 chairs side by side had become their habit. The land stretched out before them, green and alive. Samuel took a slow sip of coffee, then set his cup down. "Clara," he said, his voice steady but warm, "when you first asked to stay, I thought I was just giving you a place to rest. But it turns out, you've given me something I didn't know I needed." She turned to him, her heart thudding. "What's that?" He met her gaze, his eyes kind. "A reason to look forward to the days ahead." Clara's throat tightened. She reached for his hand without thinking, and he held it gently. For a long moment, they sat like that, watching the land they had worked together, the place that had brought them both back to life. Neither of them had expected this when their paths first crossed. But in the quiet strength of shared work, in the trials of storms and hard days, they had found something rare. Not just survival, not just a deal of food and chores, but a partnership built on trust, respect, and a quiet kind of love. As the sun rose higher, the ranch stretched out before them, steady and alive. It was no longer Samuel's lonely place or Clara's last chance. It was their home, and their story was only beginning.